Slide. And now I'd like to introduce our very honored guest tonight. We're very lucky to have one of the Brunswick Civil War Roundtable advisors as our speaker tonight. Dr. Chris Mackowski is the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Emerging Civil War and is the senior editor for the Emerging Civil War series. Additionally, he serves as vice president on the board of directors for Central Virginia Battlefield Trust and serves as an advisor to the Civil War Roundtable Congress. Chris is the historian in residence at Stevens Ridge at historic property on the Spotsylvania battlefield, and they hold an excellent 3-day seminar every summer. There again, if you're interested in attending it, I have been to just about every one. They didn't have them during COVID, but just about every one of them. And you can find more information on their webpage and their Facebook page. Dr. Mackowski has authored and co-authored over a dozen books, numerous essay collections on the Civil War, and written articles for major Civil War magazines. He'll be available for a book signing after the presentation and after the question and answer session. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Chris Mackowski.
Okay, sure. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I have to admit, when Gar told me he was stepping down, I was like, oh my gosh, who's going to take care of me? And then Ann stepped up and she's been wonderful. You guys are just the template for first class roundtable. So I want to say thank you to the staff. Thanks to the folks up in the booth, the staff here at Hatch Auditorium, and all the volunteers who make this such an exceptional roundtable. Give yourselves a round of applause. The auditorium looks beautiful since I was here last. I have to admit, when Ann got up and started speaking and the lights came on, I was reminded of that scene from the Charlie Brown Christmas special when Linus goes out on the stage and he goes, lights, please. And then the lights come up and he gives a wonderful monologue. And I was like, oh, wow, this is great. What a great place to be back to. As Ann mentions, I'm with a group of historians called Emerging Civil War, www.emergingcivilwar.com. It's a blog with more than 30 historians that are offering free content every day. A lot of different writing styles, a lot of people with different interests from geographic areas, all of us with a public history background, meaning that we're used to dealing with the public and telling the public about what we see as America's defining event. And we'd love to have you as part of that conversation. So join in with us, emergingcivilwar.com. We do have a monthly newsletter that we send out by email. If you're interested, I'll have a sign-up sheet up here at my table. Feel free to put your name and your email address on there. We'll add you to the list. We don't give email addresses out to anybody, so your emails will be safe with us. But it's a way for us to stay in touch with you so you can find out, who's up to what projects we have going on, who's speaking where, those sorts of things. It's just a part of that way that we maintain our community. And as Ann mentioned, we have a symposium the first weekend of every August. It's on the Spotsylvania Courthouse battlefield. This year, our theme is 1863, the great task before us. And our keynote speaker will be Tim Smith of the West, who'll be coming east to talk a little bit about Grant at Vicksburg. We have 10 speakers all together over the course of the weekend. We'll have a battlefield tour of the first day of Chancellorsville and talk a little bit about what happened on the ground. And so we'd love to have you stop in and hang out with us. I think last I heard, we only have about 20 tickets left. You can find details for that on our website. And then my last little bit of business, you'll see that I have some books set up here. This is how I stay out of jail, is I write books. My youngest son just turned 6 last week. I'm still paying for that birthday party. So if you'd like to come help me with that, feel free to come see the book table, buy 7 or 8, help me pay for all those balloons and the trampoline park, which was insane. So Love to have you to stop by. I sent a PowerPoint in. I'm not sure if I hardly ever use PowerPoints. The fact that the word PowerPoint just came out of my mouth, some of you are probably like, oh, when did you start doing that? But here we go. It's like 12 slides to make you feel like you've seen a PowerPoint. That's what tonight's PowerPoint is going to be about. But you can see in the very small print underneath the logo, Emerging Civil Wars website, if you're interested there. So I'll have us start with our first slide here. And this is a picture of my friend Kurt Fields, who is a living historian who portrays Ulysses S. Grant. Some of you may know Kurt. And this is the day he first introduced me to Thomas Jesse, who portrays Robert E. Lee. And they were speaking at the Williamsburg Civil War Roundtable, and they wanted to come to the wilderness. Kurt had never been there, and Thomas hadn't been there since he was a kid, well before he got interested in Civil War stuff. And so Bill Miller from the roundtable there brought him up, and the four of us did wilderness in Spotsylvania over the course of the day. And it was really exciting for both of these guys because they wanted to go where Grant and Lee were in the Overland campaign. And so it was a really cool experience. And we got to this particular location. This is the Brock Road, Plank Road intersection in the wilderness. And we got there and Kurt's like, this is it. This is like one of the three places that were seminal in Grant's story. And so he wanted to walk the ground because he talks about these things in his presentations, and he wanted to match up the accounts with the topography and the landscape. And it was really kind of neat to be there with him as he was having a moment. And I love this particular spot because I am a firm believer that the wilderness and this intersection in particular is the turning point of the Civil War. Now, some of you are like, what? How many of you have probably heard that Gettysburg was the turning point of the Civil War? Look at all those hands, yes. And I'm here tonight to tell you that's balderdash. Okay? The turning point of the Civil, and the claps comes from a guy wearing an emerging Civil War hat in the back, by the way, so double points to you, Rich. The reason that the wilderness is the turning point of the Civil War is because up to that point in the war, armies would come together and they would fight for a couple days, and then they would withdraw, and then they would catch their breath, and they would take time to reinforce and re-equip and resupply, and then they'd go back at it again after a few weeks or even a few months. And when Grant gets into the wilderness, he's not going to allow for that time out. At that intersection, he makes the decision to just go around Robert E. Lee. Couldn't get at him, couldn't beat him in the wilderness. So instead of withdrawing, he just goes around and forces Lee to come after him. And they start fighting the next morning at Spotsylvania Courthouse, 10 miles down the road. And from there, they go down to the North Anna River. And from there, they get down to Totopotomoy Creek and Cold Harbor. And they jump the James and go to Petersburg. And they settle into a 9-month siege that inevitably, inexorably leads to Appomattox Courthouse. The wilderness makes that happen. That's why it's the turning point of the war. But Kurt said, well, it's one of three places. And I said, well, what are your other two options? And he says, Fort Donelson and Belmont. Now, I bet there's somebody in this room that's like, Belmont? Isn't that a horse race? Is that, no, Belmont. We'll talk about that in just a second. And there are a lot of different people who have a lot of different theories about where these key moments of the Civil War were. I'd never heard Belmont on that list. My friend Gordon Ray, who is the Dean of Overland Studies, I'm sure you're familiar with his work. He agrees that the wilderness is kind of the spot, but he told me a story just last summer about a symposium he was at, and he was sitting at a table with Ed Bars, former chief historian of the National Park Service and former chief historian out at Vicksburg. And it may come as no surprise, but Ed said Vicksburg was the turning point of the war, because if it hadn't been for Vicksburg, Grant never would have been in the wilderness. And Gordon said, well, that's true. But if we follow that logic backwards, then the real turning point of the Civil War, Gordon says, was when Grant's father, Jesse, got a little gleam in his eye. And so from there, things go forward. And that's absolutely true. And if we think about the wilderness and how it inexorably leads to Appomattox Courthouse, we could take that backwards. You know, he's in the wilderness because actually he was named general in chief of the Union armies and lieutenant general in March. So really that's the turning point of the Civil War, because he gets the ability to command and set strategy and direct troops. But, you know, he's only there because he was successful at Chattanooga. So really it's Chattanooga that is the seminal moment, because like he's successful there and that it gets him that promotion. But he's only in Chattanooga because he succeeded in capturing Vicksburg after all of those months. So really it's Vicksburg, right? Vicksburg is what unleashes Grant finally. But of course, he's only at Vicksburg and succeeds there because he survives Shiloh. Okay, so Shiloh, as stunning as it was, that's really the turning point of the war. It launches this rise of Grant to his success. But of course, he's only at Shiloh because he had succeeded at Fort Donelson just a few months earlier. And so Fort Donelson must be the key moment. That's where Grant gets unleashed. And as Kurt said, that's one of those seminal moments. But of course, if it's not, he's not at Donelson if it wasn't for the fabulous Battle of Belmont, right? And because he wins at Belmont, that sets him up for success. And so we could parse all of this backwards to kind of look at the narrative arc that is Ulysses S. Grant's career. And as Civil War students, we tend to look at that as a discrete event, the rise of Grant, we call it. How many of you have heard that term, the rise of Grant? Okay. And it seems so neat and tidy, and we've got these dominoes that fall. So somewhere along the way, something happens to lead to the rise of Grant. But as we'll talk about tonight, each of these moments is a moment of contingency where it doesn't inevitably, inexorably lead to the next moment. Because even though each of these incidents opens the door to opportunity, challenges arise. And it's not just Grant's activity that leads him to that next opportunity, but like the Deza Mekana, the hand of God reaches in. In many cases, the hand of Lincoln reaches in and adjusts events to allow that rise to continue. So really, I want us by the end of tonight to think about really the series of contingencies that allow Grant to eventually become Grant. And the rise really isn't as smooth as it appears. Thank you for the bottle of water, by the way. But of all those moments, was there one that was particularly important, particularly interesting? Because, you know, we all want to be able to put our finger on that moment. Here's where it happened. We were there at the birth. And Grant himself offers us some clues in his own work. And we'll talk about that a little bit tonight. So if I could ask you to kind of jump ahead 2 slides, because I never do PowerPoint. So, and I'm Polish. I did these in the wrong order. You know, that just happens. So what is the Battle of Belmont? So it happens November 6th, 1861, and Grant is stationed in Cairo, Illinois. And he sees that Bishop Leonidas Polk has violated Kentucky's neutrality. So he's going to look for a way to poke in the eye. And he's going to march down the Missouri bank of the Mississippi River, and he's going to attack a Confederate fortification on the Mississippi bank that's across from the main Confederate outpost in Kentucky. And he goes sweeping in there, and his men drive the Confederates out. It's more like an organized mob that quickly breaks down into a mob. It's their first time in combat, and this is his first time leading in combat. And because the Federals sweep into the Confederate camps and flush the Confederates out, then the Federals are like, ooh, look, plunder. And they stop being an army and turn into that mob. And that gives Bishop Polk the time to call in reinforcements, and they close in on Grant, who then marches his guys back to the boats that are waiting to ship his men to safety. He loses a regiment. He goes looking for him. He almost gets shot. He rides back to the boat. And as they're pulling up the plank, his horse leaps out onto the plank and onto the boat in the nick of time. Okay. It's a victory in the same way that if you've ever been to your kids' or your grandkids' indoor soccer game when they're like 7, And it's just a big scrum of kids following a soccer ball around a room. Anybody seen that before? That's the Battle of Belmont. But why is that important? Why would Kurt say that is like one of those moments? Well, it's his first time in combat. And now he has found out that he is daring. He is bold. He's got the vision to coordinate with the Navy, which is going to be a huge part of our story tonight. We think of the Defense Department today, and the Army and the Navy are two branches of the service that fall under that same umbrella. Back then, the War Department and the Navy Department were two separate departments, and they did not have to coordinate if they didn't want to. And Grant recognizes the value of that partnership and will spend considerable time cultivating that relationship with the different naval commanders in his theater or his theaters over the course of the war. So that's another big outcome of the Battle of Belmont. It gets Grant on Lincoln's radar screen. Not like, oh, this is the guy that's going to win the war for me, but like, hey, okay, we got to win. You know, after that embarrassment at Ball's Bluff just a couple of weeks earlier, this is some good news. So that's why Belmont is important, because it positions him for the next step. Does it unlock him and send him off to Vicksburg and the wilderness and the White House? No, but it lets him take that next step. Well, what is that next step? Forts Henry and Donelson, pardon me, where he coordinates with the Navy, already applying that lesson he just learned, to circle in on Fort Henry, which is on the Tennessee River. And 12 miles to the east is Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. And they're guarding these waterways that basically act as avenues deep into the Confederacy, all the way down into the deep south of Mississippi. Right? And so by targeting these two forts, he can open up these avenues of invasion. He needs the Navy to circle in on the Tennessee River to block Fort Henry from the water side. He's going to land troops to the north, march down, and encircle the fort on the land side. That's the plan. Mother Nature actually ends up doing the work. Heavy rains bring the water level up in the river, and they flood out the Confederate defenders at Fort Henry. And so the Navy captures the fort before Grant even gets there. So what does Grant do? Let's head on over to Fort Donelson. And he's going to march off to the east to capture Donelson. Now, one of the things he does here that I love, and most people don't realize this, is as he goes, he does not string telegraph wire. Anybody know why that might be important? Because if he doesn't have a telegraph, he can't have his boss, Henry Halleck, breathing down his neck. What's going on now? What's going on now? What's going on now? He can ask for forgiveness instead of permission. Okay, another important lesson Grant's going to learn as part of this narrative. So he gets to Fort Donelson. The Navy sails downstream in the Tennessee River, upriver in the Ohio, comes upriver the Cumberland, sees Fort Donelson. They're going to do the same thing they just did at Fort Henry, but Fort Donelson is ready. And for those of you who've been there, you know, they've got those river batteries that are all just pointing at a straight stretch, and you can literally start shooting at the Federal Navy a mile away. And it is February 14th. Happy Valentine's Day, Andrew Foote. Boom, boom, boom. The Confederates call them Iron Valentines. And they are so effective that they cripple Foote's fleet, and he's not able to do his part of the job. And he's going to let his guns drift out, or his boats drift out of range. And Grant's going to come to the fort and encircle most of it on the western side, not having any support on the river side. And Grant's like, all right, we'll see what we can do. And while he's conferring with Foote, Confederates try a breakout, and his men are only barely able to contain it. And Grant comes riding back to the battlefield, and he directs a counterattack, and he's able to stop the Confederate attempts to break out. Here's another turning point that most people don't think of, but it's a huge turning point in Grant's life, because a newspaper correspondent captures a sketch of Grant on horseback, directing reinforcements and holding a cigar. And that appears in papers all across the country. And people are like, ooh, yes, Ulysses S. Grant loves cigars. Let's send him some. And he will be flooded with cigars. He actually preferred chewing tobacco up to that point. He gets a cigar, like suddenly everybody in camp gets a cigar because he's got too many cigars. But that actually is going to trigger a shift to cigar smoking. In the Battle of the Wilderness, one witness sees him smoking 20 cigars in a day. He's not smoking that many cigars every day, but he becomes a pretty heavy smoker, particularly when he's stressed. That's important because by 1884, he'll have cancer of the mouth and throat that will kill him. That starts at Fort Donelson. But we're going to come back to that part of our story in just a few minutes. So Grant bottles up the Confederates. They have to surrender, right? The guy who's in charge, John Floyd, doesn't want to be embarrassed by having to surrender. So he's going to ask his second in command, Gideon Pillow, you do it. Pillow's like, I don't want to be embarrassed to surrender. And he turns to the third in command, Simon Bolivar Buckner, who's like, oh, crap. So he's got to do the surrender. Nathan Bedford Forrest, in charge of the Confederate cavalry, is so disgusted, he leaves with his 800 cavalrymen and escapes, leaving poor Buckner to hold the bag. And he sends out word to Grant. What are the terms for surrender? And Grant says, I propose to move on your works immediately, so no terms but immediate and unconditional surrender. Earns a famous nickname. Yeah, right. Unconditional Surrender Grant. He becomes a national hero for capturing some 14,000 men of the Confederate Army. And Buckner and Grant will get together at the Dover Hotel and they'll sign, surrender agreements. And Buckner, who'd been friends with Grant prior to the war, I love this story. You might know the story that Grant was asked to leave the United States Army. And so he was on the West Coast at the time. He had to sail down around the southern tip of South America and back up in New York and then go over to St. Louis from there. And when he got to New York, he ran out of money. And Buckner happened to be stationed there at the time. And Buckner lent him enough money to get home. So after Buckner surrenders at Fort Donelson, Grant pulls Buckner aside and says, you got enough money to get home. Despite this terrible loss for Buckner, the friendship between the two of them still comes through, and they will reunite again years later. So if I could ask you to back up one slide, if you don't mind. So Jack Hurst, who wrote a great book, Men of Fire, he calls Fort Donelson the campaign that won the Civil War, because by getting the nickname Ulysses S. Grant Unconditional, look, he's even got the initials for it. I mean, that's beautiful, right? By becoming Unconditional Surrender Grant, that launches him on his upward trajectory where he's able to capture all these places and get to lead Appomattox and win the White House and et cetera, et cetera. So Hearst argues that that's why this is the campaign that wins the war, which looks neat and tidy, except what happens to Grant afterwards is that Henry Halleck, who's not been kept in the loop on the telegraph, starts to get jealous. Grant just took Henry, or gets credit for it, and he just took Fort Donelson. And the fall of Donelson opens the Cumberland and the way to Nashville. And Halleck orders him to not go capture the Tennessee capital, because Halleck, either being overcautious if we're generous, or jealous if we're not, doesn't want Grant to go there. Grant recognizes, though, the Confederate, the Tennessee capital is vulnerable. If Confederates get there and they occupy it, they'll have a tough time getting them out. So he actually is going to coordinate with a portion of Don Carlos Buell's army under Bull Nelson to move there and occupy that strategic position. So even though he can't get there himself, he makes sure the base is covered. He'll eventually go to Clarksville to confer with Nelson, and Halleck will write him up on charges of leaving his department, disobeying orders. Grant's like, what do you mean? I'm just going, I didn't. And Halleck, this drives me nuts about the guy. He's talking out of both sides of his mouth at this point. Because then he's like, well, I just, Washington, Stanton. In the meantime, Halleck is talking to his boss, George McClellan, General-in-Chief of the Army. And he's saying that Grant is insubordinate and he's disobeying orders. And if I could, I would remove him from service, but success prevents me from doing so. And McClellan says, well, if the good of the service demands it, remove him from office. And so there's all this terrible backbiting going on. At the same time, Grant is writing letters to his wife, Julia, saying, there is no finer man in this army that I would rather work for than Henry Halleck, who has got his stuff together. And he says that McClellan is a genius and these two men are fantastic. He loves working for him. All the while, they're plotting behind his back. If I could ask the slide to advance 2, please. We'll go past Grant. And we'll get to Henry Halleck, a man who looks like he slept on a park bench and then came into the War Department and said, what's going on today? Oh, right. He's a guy who's got a brilliant reputation. He did well at West Point. He's known as Old Brains because he's a military theorist. He is brilliant. Everything on paper looks great. The guy is really an excellent strategist. The problem is that he's so worried about his reputation that he doesn't risk damaging it, which means he doesn't risk success. And that's why, he doesn't do anything himself, but then he gets jealous when other people do. So Fort Donelson does not unlock this upward trajectory for Grant the way most people think it does, because Halleck is getting in his way. And Grant doesn't know it. Finally, it takes Abraham Lincoln's intervention. What's going on with this Grant guy? I can't spare the man, he fights. Now, scholar Brooks Simpson has done a lot of research on that particular phrase to find out where it came from. And as it turns out, he can't find it. And if anybody could find it, it would be Brooks. So it's likely an apocryphal statement, but it does sum up Lincoln's attitude toward Grant at this point. And he says to Halleck, unless there are specific charges against Grant, I want you to return him to service. And so the administrative leave that Grant has been put on gets lifted. And Halleck's like, oh, I've done everything I could to get this lifted for you so you can get back out there and get at him. All right, go to it. And Grant has no idea. So Grant returns to the Army toward the end of March of 62, just in time for the Battle of Shiloh. His men are deployed at a place called Pittsburgh Landing, where they're going to head down and capture the Confederate rail junction of Corinth, Mississippi. But, nobody's really expecting the Confederates to do anything. So the Federals are kind of splashed out from the river here all the way across the fields. Billy Sherman's kind of out in the woods like, yeah, everything's fine. Everything's fine. And of course, everything's not fine. Albert Sidney Johnston comes up from Corinth and punches Sherman in the nose, punches Prentiss in the nose. And they're all like, ooh, where did that come from? Grant is at his headquarters in Savannah, which is several miles upriver, and he comes down to the battlefield and tries to see what's going on. Terrible first day of fighting. The Federals are driven from almost every position on the battlefield. Eventually, their center at the Hornet's Nest collapses. It's a disaster. And on a rainy night, after walking through a hospital where the sight of blood and gore disturbs and distresses him so much that he goes and sits beneath a rainy oak tree. And Sherman comes up to him and he says, the devil's had his day today. And Grant very calmly, very coolly says, look him tomorrow. And he does. He launches the attack in the morning and boom, after a heavy, heavy day of fighting that tends to get overlooked when people study Shiloh, he's able to drive the Confederates away. Now, here's another one of those big turning points, not really part of the Grant arc, but of course, the death of Albert Sidney Johnston, the Confederate commander. And it becomes a central linchpin and part of the lost cause mythology after the war. Well, if only Johnston hadn't been killed, he would have swept Grant into the river, and all these what ifs and what ifs and what ifs. It's the same reason why people kind of look at Gettysburg as this whole big turning point. But it's really kind of important for what didn't happen, not for what did. Johnston's killed. PGT Beauregard actually mounts a fairly good fight on the second day of the battle, but he's driven away. So that must be the turning point, right? Shiloh, we have got rid of this vaunted Confederate commander. We've cleared the way to Corinth. Off we go. And it is a turning point in the sense that 23,000 casualties is more than anybody has seen in the war. It changes the scope and scale of the Civil War in the American imagination. As one writer said, the South never smiled again after Shiloh. So Shiloh opens the door for Grant to sweep, except that Old Brains comes down to the battlefield himself. Says, okay, now that you've won the battle, I'm going to take over field command. Here we go. And he promotes Grant so that Grant is now second in command of the department. But Halleck does it because it essentially turns Grant into a supernumerary. He's a chief of staff. Orders go directly to the corps commanders, not through Grant. Grant doesn't plan anything. He gets pretty frustrated because now that Halleck has shown up, he wants to take control of the army, take credit for what's going on out there, and Grant is left stymied, impotent. And Halleck, in his super aggressive fashion, as he looks at Corinth, Mississippi, he digs in. The next day, there's Corinth, and he digs in. And that's how the rest of April and May go, as Halleck creeps forward, and Grant is losing his mind. And he thinks about quitting. And Sherman talks him out of it. He says, just wait. Something will happen to restore you to your proper place. Meanwhile, Halleck continues to be coy. If I could ask you to advance to the next slide for me, please. And he sends this letter to Grant. I'm very much surprised, General, that you should find any cause of complaint in the recent assignment of commands. You have precisely the position that your rank entitles you to. I mean, doesn't it just sound great? Like, you're second in command. You've won. Look at this, right? You certainly will not suspect me of any intention to injure your feeling or reputation or to do you any injustice. In other words, like, I just promoted you. I wouldn't be doing you any harm, right? For the last 3 months, I've done everything in my power to ward off the attacks which were made upon you. I can't even say that with a straight face. If you believe me your friend, you'll not require an explanation. If not, explanations on my part would be of little avail. You rotten bastard. I mean, that's all I can say. Pardon my French, I'm sorry. The disingenuousness of this is just galling to me. It's 161 years later. Get over it, Chris. But it's like, but if you read Grant's memoirs, as he's writing about Shiloh, he talks about, at the time he had no clue about Halleck's duplicity. But as he's writing the memoirs, he's reflecting on it. He's like, at the time, I thought he was my friend. I didn't realize he's turning into one of my greatest obstacles. And here's again why Shiloh doesn't launch him forward. He's stuck behind Halleck in this creep toward Corinth. What actually saves Grant here is something completely out of his control. It's the hand of Lincoln again reaching into the story. You might remember that out east, George McClellan has been commander of all Union armies and has not done a spectacularly good job of it. And so he gets demoted in March prior to what becomes the Peninsula Campaign. Lincoln says, I want you to just be in charge of the Army of the Potomac. If I can have you advance to the next slide, please, because we should look at Little Mac here. Look, I should do this too. Okay. So he's going to be in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and Lincoln himself, along with Stanton, are going to sort of act as general-in-chief of the army. They're going to try to run the army themselves. Doesn't go particularly well. And particularly after McClellan gets his nose bloodied in the 7 days battles at the end of June and the beginning of July of 62, Lincoln finally realizes, I can't run this army and do this, that, and the other thing. So he needs a new general-in-chief. And who does he pick? He reaches out to the west and plucks Old Brains out of the trenches around Corinth and brings him to the east, promotes him to general-in-chief of the army. Because at that time, Halleck is the leading victor in the entire federal army. He's taking credit for everything Grant has done. So of course he looks great. Old Brains, yeah. Who doesn't want a guy like that on your staff? Lincoln has no idea that he's getting a first-rate clerk at this point, right? With Halleck gone, that allows Grant to then become the commander of the department. So now his rise continues again, but it isn't because of anything that happened in Shiloh, unless it's that Halleck took the credit for Shiloh. So then Grant becomes commander. He's got some battles around Iuka. He takes Corinth again, and then he sets his sight on Vicksburg, Mississippi. And if I can have you advance to the next slide, please. It's going to take him months to get to Vicksburg. He's going to have several attempts. First, he's going to head south from LaGrange, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner of the map there. And as he heads down into Mississippi, Earl Van Dorn is going to have a cavalry raid that attacks his supplies at Holly Springs, and it's going to force Grant to pull back. He's going to send Sherman on an expeditionary force down to Chickasaw Bayou, just north of Vicksburg, and Sherman will be rebuffed there. It's an especially bad blow because it comes just before the new year, as the Emancipation Proclamation is supposed to go into effect. Lincoln needs a battlefield victory to give teeth to the Emancipation Proclamation, and he doesn't get it. But he still has patience with Grant, and he allows Grant to keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. In fact, on the 4th of July, 1863, the very day that Vicksburg falls, before Lincoln gets news of the fall of Vicksburg, he tells his cabinet that Grant, as long as he takes Vicksburg, doesn't matter how he does it, so long as he does it right, he is my man and I am his for the rest of the war. And then news comes later that day that Vicksburg falls. So all through the early months of 63, Grant will try digging a canal. He'll try going up one bayou or the other. He'll try to circumvent. He'll do all these sorts of things until finally he runs the guns in front of Vicksburg, lands on the east bank of the river, south of the city, marches inland throughout the interior of Mississippi, just moving with impunity through Jefferson Davis's home state. Oh yeah, rub your nose in that, Jeff Davis. And then he comes up on Vicksburg from the east after fighting battles at Port Gibson, at Raymond, at Jackson. There's an excellent new book on the Battle of Jackson, Mississippi down on this table, by the way. And so finally, then he launches a series of assaults on the 19th and 22nd, settles into a 47-day siege, and Vicksburg finally falls. Turning point of the war. For those of you who've heard about Gettysburg, some of you have also heard Vicksburg falls at the same time, and that's really the turning point. And I love to watch the grudge match between the Sharks and the Jets, the Gettysburg folks and the Vicksburg folks. Jets, right? They go at it, right? And you put them together, and that's a big turning point. And then Tullahoma is off in the corner going, well, what about me? All three major Union armies score victories within weeks of each other. Okay. So certainly in that rich context where the whole momentum of the war shifts, this is where Grant is rocketed to success, right? Except what happens to him afterwards? He sets his sights on Mobile, Alabama. He doesn't want to let grass grow under his feet. But Halleck says, no, we don't need Mobile yet. Like they've been looking at Mobile for 6 months. But Halleck is jealous about Vicksburg. And he doesn't want to then give Grant the chance to go off and yet score another victory in Mobile. And so Grant will literally watch Halleck strip pieces of the Army of the Tennessee and reassign them into small details all over the Western theater. And Grant, powerless to do anything about it, says thereupon began the dissolution of an army that had so recently achieved such success. And there's nothing he can do about it. And so this is how the summer of 63 passes for Grant and into the fall. Well, what else is going on elsewhere on the map? We have the Battle of Chickamauga, Confederate victory made possible by the sudden appearance of 2 divisions from the Army of Northern Virginia. What are these guys doing in Georgia? Well, in fact, it's because out in the Eastern Theater, George Gordon Meade, the winner of the Battle of Gettysburg, and a guy I really respect, but he hasn't really done anything else. And Lincoln says to him, well, your army's too big to not be used for offensive operations. And so he's going to strip elements away from Meade. And he's like, ah. But Lincoln can't really do anything about Meade because he's the victor of the Battle of Gettysburg. Right? So as Lincoln's trying to kind of solve these issues, he's suddenly like, wait, where's Grant? And he realizes that Halleck has him kind of just dangling. And again, the hand of Lincoln reaches out and plucks Grant and brings him to Chattanooga. That's where the other elements of Meade's army are coming. That's where the Longstreet's men from the Army of Northern Virginia are converging with Braxton Bragg. And Grant gets this promotion, despite the fact that Halleck's been holding him down. Okay. So he shows up as commander, he opens up the supply line, drives the Confederates off Missionary Ridge, has some great success. Chattanooga becomes this great opportunity for him. He reorganizes the army. He really is now starting to move with army groups because he has the Army of the Tennessee. He's got the Army of the Cumberland. He's going to have elements from the Union 11th and 12th Corps from the Army of the Potomac. And he's going to start thinking in terms of army groups. All the strategy that he has learned trying to capture Vicksburg then comes into play here at Chattanooga. And his success there is then going to open up some doors for him. If I could ask you to advance the slide to the next picture, please. Oh, there's our surrender at Vicksburg. Poor Pemberton way in over his head there. And there's a cannon that basically looks like a big middle finger, to Pemberton. Next slide, please. Okay, so there we have Grant, who's now been set up for success. And because he succeeds as commander of the Western Theater at Chattanooga, Lincoln's going to tap him to come to the East. Why? Well, as Grant's winning Chattanooga, what's George Gordon Meade doing? He has the unfortunate mine run campaign where nothing happens. The great battle never fought, as it's called. Okay. And so Grant's having this great success. Meade is not. And I commend Meade for not attacking at Mine Run. A lot of people are down on him. He absolutely did the right thing. But Lincoln starts thinking as winter comes, like, it's 64 is on the horizon. It's the election year. And if this war continues to drag out, he's going to lose. The South will earn its independence. But he can't fire George Gordon Meade because he's the victor at Gettysburg. And Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania, which Lincoln needs for his reelection prospects. Meade is a Pennsylvanian. You can't poke the hometown boy. And he hasn't really done anything wrong. He just hasn't done the next big thing right. And so Lincoln is very creative in the way he solves this. When he promotes Grant to be lieutenant general, he leaves Meade in place and he just promotes Grant above him. It's a great bit of creative politics. And so when Grant goes down to meet Meade for the first time, Meade offers his resignation, and Grant, he says, you know, you're going to want to have your own guys here. I understand, for the good of the service, you can remove me, no hard feelings. And Grant said he was immediately impressed by that. And he keeps Meade on. He says that Meade's willingness to do what was necessary for the good of the service impressed him more than Meade's victory at Gettysburg. And so Grant will tag along with Meade through the wilderness as the spring campaign opens. They get to the wilderness, they fight for a couple of days. And instead of withdrawing, Grant goes around. They get to Spotsylvania. They fight for 2 weeks. Grant goes around down to North Anna, down to Totopotomoy Creek, down to Cold Harbor, across the James to Petersburg, where they settle into a 9-month siege that eventually leads to Appomattox Courthouse. We've heard that before, right? There we go. There's the story. So, as we think about those dominoes, and when one domino falls, it doesn't necessarily trigger the next one. So we can't look at that as a nice, neat narrative arc, because a lot of times Lincoln has to reach in there and set the dominoes up or knock them over himself. These moments of contingency keep Grant in the ballgame, but they also create obstacles. So as Grant himself looked back on this sequence of events, he was able to sort of pinpoint for him what was the key moment. If I could ask the slide to advance to the next picture for us, please. We know this because of this man. His name's Robert Underwood Johnson. He's an editor for the Century magazine, which wanted to publish a series of firsthand accounts from the principal participants of the Civil War. It's a project they come up with an idea for in the 1884 or 1883, excuse me. We know this collection of essays today as Battles and Leaders. How many of you have read or have copies of Battles and Leaders at home? And it comes from this series of newspaper articles. This is brilliant. It was a great idea. But when they first reach out to Grant in January of 84, he says, no, I'm not interested in writing my memoirs. I'm not interested in writing about my experience. He says, you know, my staff member, Adam Badow, has written the 3-volume military history of Ulysses S. Grant. It's all there. You know, I gave it my blessing. I read it all. That's fine. I don't have anything to add. And so the Century magazine editor's like, well, I mean, if Grant doesn't write, the series is dead in the water. He's the most prominent guy. We got to have him. You know, by that point, Lee and Lincoln are both dead. And so they give up on the idea. But in May of 1884, Grant is swindled by 2 of his business partners. And one day he thinks he's a millionaire, and the next he's $13.5 million in debt. He's got $80 in his pocket, and his wife, Julia, has $120 in the cookie jar at home, and that's it. And so as he tries to wrap his mind around this huge turn in fortune, he wants to figure out how to earn some money, and he won't take loans. He's too proud to take a loan from anybody. He won't take gifts. And so Johnson comes to him after hearing about this financial collapse, and he says, I'd be willing to pay you to write these articles. And Grant immediately invites him over to talk. And when Johnson shows up at the cottage on Long Branch, New Jersey, on the Jersey Shore, Grant's had to retreat there because everything else has been lost in the collapse, and he can't find a seller to buy this house at a reasonable market value, so they hold on to it. And Johnson shows up, and he says that Grant had about him the air of a wounded lion. And Grant's very forthcoming about what happened in his business misfortune. He was totally swindled, by someone who was running a Ponzi scheme out of his investment shop. And so as they talk, they come to an agreement where Johnson will pay Grant $500 an article. And they agree that Grant will write 4 articles. He'll write about Shiloh. He'll write about Vicksburg. He'll write about the wilderness, and he'll write about Appomattox Courthouse. And so Johnson goes back to the office. He's super excited. No sooner does he get there than a note arrives from Grant, who's thought about it, and he wants to swap out Appomattox for Chattanooga. And Johnson's peers are like, what do you mean? Like, everybody wants to know about Appomattox for credit. Like, that's the one thing we have to have is Appomattox. And Johnson's like, listen, we're just going to let the guy write what the guy wants to write. We should be lucky he's writing for us at all. Let's just let him do it. And so Grant will go ahead and start writing on Shiloh right away. And I want you to think about that decision for a second. Grant himself thought that Chattanooga was more important than Appomattox. Yeah. Because most of us would be like, what did Grant think about Appomattox, right? Chattanooga was more important to him than Appomattox. So he starts writes about Shiloh, and he starts writing about Vicksburg, or the way he goes into the wilderness next, then into Vicksburg. And as he's writing, he discovers that he loves writing. He never thought of himself as a writer before, but he just loves the work. And so he realizes that he's got more to say than just these 4 articles. He's got a book that he wants to write. And I've spoken to you guys about that story before. So he decides he's going to write his memoirs. Okay? And if I could have you advance to the next slide, please. And so Century Magazine will lose out on the memoirs to Mark Twain, who will go through great lengths to protect Grant's financial interests. Grant's already been swindled by one business partner. Twain wants to make him feel secure that he won't get swindled by another. For instance, they put the copyright of the memoirs under Julia Grant's name so that creditors can't try to get the royalties to help pay off debts. Grant gets 85% of the sales of each book. But Twain's like, this is going to be a money-making machine. He says that everyone in America will be morally obligated to buy this book. And he's right. Within the first 6 months, Julia will get a royalty check for $250,000. She'll get $400,000 after the first year. Yeah. Takes him 11 months to write. 2 volumes, 1,231 pages, more than 290,000 words. This is a monument. And where does he split those? Between Vicksburg and Chattanooga. And again, you know, from a narrative point of view, that's kind of midway between the wars. So maybe that makes sense. But the first part of the first book is like, you know, Mexican War stuff and family stuff. He could have split those books in a lot of different places. But Grant himself saw Vicksburg as the culmination of volume 1. And Chattanooga was the start of something new. And the second book starts there because now he is unencumbered. Lincoln has finally lived up to that promise that Grant is my man and I am his for the rest of the war. And he plucks Grant out from under Halleck's thumb, gives him the freedom to do what Grant does best. And all those lessons from Belmont onward, being bold, thinking about coordinating with the Navy, taking risks, moving army groups around, all come to fruition at Chattanooga, which then sets the stage for him to higher things, where he's not only paying attention to Meade and the Army of the Potomac, but he's paying attention to Sherman. He's paying attention to Ben Butler. He's paying attention to Franz Sigel. He has pieces all across the national chessboard. And he has the power to move them. And he, looking at his own story, thought that it was Vicksburg that finally set him up for that success, even though it took a couple months for Lincoln to be like, wait, where is he? Once Lincoln did, boom, the rise of Grant. And so now when I stand in that crossroads, in the wilderness, the Brock Road, Plank Road intersection. And I think about the crossroads that Lincoln stood at, or excuse me, that Grant stood at that very same intersection. A crossroads not only in the wilderness, not only during the battle, not only during the campaign, but a crossroads for his own career, a crossroads for the war itself. And I consider all those things he learned along the way and brought with him to that intersection so that he could make the choice that changed the very nature of the war and changed American history itself. Thank you very much. And if I could just ask in the booth, if we could put it to the last slide for me for just a second. This is going to be where I shill my books. These are some, I've got a birthday party to pay for, right? Yeah. So these are some of the grant related books that I have down front, but feel free to come and browse. We have time for Q&A.
We've got time for some questions as people quietly leave the auditorium. And as you know, especially for the new folks here, and great to see that kind of participation from newcomers, this could be the most interesting part of tonight. So you stay around and you learn something else. So question right here in the front, and I'll do my best to get to you as fast as I can. Hold the microphone right in front of your mouth. You must use the microphone for the people that are on the Zoom call tonight.
What people who are leaving don't realize is that we're about to announce the winning lottery ticket numbers for tomorrow. And, you know,
so you talk about Grant under Halleck. Talk to us how he treated Halleck after he became his boss.
To Grant's great credit, there's not a whole lot of rubbing his nose in it. By the time Grant becomes general in chief of the Army, Lincoln has recognized Halleck's inadequacies and also his strengths. One thing we forget is, like, you know, when Lincoln calls Halleck a first-rate clerk, There's something to be said for that because he serves as chief of staff of the Army. And that frees Grant up to be in the field. Whereas if he had to be back babysitting Halleck or doing his job from Washington, he would have been less effective. So Halleck actually still frees him up and serves an important role in Grant's success. He's always kind of looking out for him, and Grant does have the benefit of being able to just talk to Lincoln directly rather than having to go through Halleck. So that's all helpful too. Halleck is relegated to the back bench. Grant's happy to keep him there, but also happy to use him in the ways he's useful. So
Here you go.
You said at Donaldson that Simon Bolivar Buckner surrendered to Grant. Was he not the father of Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., who was killed at Okinawa?
he sure was. So we have two Buckners, actually, whose birthday was just last week. My great Polish brother, Chris Kolakowski, who also worked Rights for Emerging Civil War, just wrote about Buckner's 200th birthday just the other day. And so, yes, he's the highest ranking, I was about to say Union, highest ranking U.S. officer killed during World War II when he's hit by a Japanese shell at Okinawa.
Here you go.
In Bruce Catton's book on the Army of the Potomac, to go back to what you said about the wilderness, at the end of the Battle of the Wilderness, Grant moved forward instead of moving back. And there's a comment that Catton made about the reaction of the Army to that move forward. Could you comment on that?
Sure. So literally Grant rides down to the intersection coming in from the north. The Union Army at that point is kind of facing to the southwest. And Grant kind of comes in, he gets to the intersection and he could turn to his left, and that would take him back toward Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg. And that's kind of what everyone's expecting. I mean, you know, that's what the Army's done. We fought and we've withdrawn. And instead, Grant reins his horse to go south down Brock Road towards Spotsylvania Courthouse. And the men who are in the earthworks with Confederates all around, they begin cheering wildly. Just by seeing the direction Grant is going, they understand things are different. And they're ordered to be quiet, and they ignore that order. They've had 3 days of just brutal fighting. The woods are burning around them. I mean, it's a horrific battle. And they cheer because they get to keep fighting. Okay, that's how emotionally powerful that moment was, to realize here was a man who said there'd be no turning back, and he holds true to that promise.
Here we go.
Thank you. I was just wondering about the surrender at Appomattox. There's so many paintings and so many stories about it. Why he thought that was unimportant?
It wasn't that he thought it was unimportant, and he does write about it in his own memoirs. In fact, a lot of the overland campaign in Petersburg sort of gets a short shrift in the book because he's dying of throat cancer and he's trying to get to the end so that he can write about that. But one of the comments that he makes when he writes about Appomattox is that history is a series of lies repeated often enough that they're believed to be true. And he talks about that in the particular context of the apple tree where Lee and Grant met the day after the surrender. And somehow it got into popular legend that that's where the surrender took place. And so the soldiers chopped the tree down and took splinters for souvenirs. And everyone in America had a toothpick from the tree. You know, I mean, it was like, we're all at Woodstock, you know, that kind of thing. And so he understood that Appomattox, even 20 years later, took on an incredible life of its own, you know, and he tried to navigate through some of that in his writing, but he was really interested already in how it was being remembered.
Got this gentleman first, and then I'll come right back at you.
Y'all are doing a real good job hanging with me tonight. I appreciate it.
I have a question that I hope that you won't give me the answer that I might expect. But I was just curious, since I haven't had an opportunity to read your work yet, but I was very, very impressed with your argument this evening. I really enjoyed it. I'm lucky to have my sister here with me tonight, and she knows that I have a an important event coming up in a few days as well. So she wants to get me one of those books for that event. And I was just curious, which one would be your recommendation?
Yeah, that's such a gift. Thank you so much. You know, it's love. That is love right there. So the talk tonight is based on an essay I wrote for Grant at 200, which was a collection of essays that Frank Scaturo and I pulled together to commemorate Grant's 200th birthday. There are essays in there from Gary Gallagher, from Tim Smith, from Joan Waugh, Ronald White. There are 11 folks who contributed essays to that. So a lot of really interesting stuff from some of the top Grant scholars in the country. So I would recommend that, not because I edited it, but because there are a lot of other smarter people than me who have contributed to it.
And how many copies should he buy of that book?
Yeah, that's
Chris, love the talk.
thank you.
In reading Grant's memoirs, although he had a lot of ups and downs during his life, he didn't speak about too many regrets other than the charge at Cold Harbor.
Mhm.
Why do you think he made that charge?
Oh, that's a great, because he had a lot of reasons to think he would succeed. He leaves North Anna thinking that Lee is on the ropes, because, he stumbles into a trap that Lee sets at North Anna, and then Lee doesn't spring the trap. And his takeaway is that Lee's army is so beaten up, it couldn't spring the trap. He doesn't know that Lee is like racked with diarrhea in his tent. That's why Lee doesn't spring the tent. So from there, they get to Totopotomoy Creek. They have some successes. At Bethesda Church, they have some successes. On June 1st, they have some successes. So he's got all these things leading up to June 3rd that he's thinking like, Lee's on the ropes. I've been winning. Here we go. Okay. And it's really, that attack was supposed to be launched on the 2nd. And because of delays, it only gets launched on the 3rd. And that gives Lee that invaluable day to dig in. And that's why it's so disastrous. But the larger point that you're asking about, why did he wrote about no regrets except for that? But as he's writing that as he's dying of cancer, he's fighting cocaine addiction because that's what they're using to swab his sore mouth. And so he's got all this stuff going on. So he rushes through all that stuff. He actually leaves a note in his own handwriting that says, if I had more time, I would write more about Spotsy and Cold Harbor. And that North Anna needed to be improved. So it's not that like he breezed by Cold Harbor because he regretted it. He breezed by Cold Harbor because he's trying to get to Appomattox before he dies, and he just doesn't have the strength to go back and flesh that out. People read too much into that comment. Certainly he regretted it, but he didn't just sort of whitewash it because he was embarrassed. He's dying. He had a question here in the front. He's got like the best mustache in the house.
He just asked the question I was going to ask.
Okay,
about
very good.
regrets.
Very good. Okay, very good.
Time for one or two more. Going once. Oh, here we go. There we go. You're right down there. Price is right. Here we go.
Come on down.
This is how I get my exercise.
Yeah. And I grew up watching Bob Barker. So Drew Carey, a nice guy. He's just not Bob Barker. Right?
Hi, I've always thought it's curious that Grant went from a relatively unsuccessful retail merchant in Galena, Illinois, to a general in the Union Army that really won the first big battle of the Civil War. How did he rise so fast when he was so far down? There must have been some other military people in the service at that time that had much greater qualifications.
There actually weren't, to be honest. And it's because war breaks out. Everyone's raising regiments. Yeah, let's go. We're going to go fight the rebels. Well, who's in charge of this regiment? Oh, well, this guy over here went to West Point and he was a hero in the Mexican War. He's a lot more qualified than any of us. Let's put him in charge. That's how he gets the job. And it's just because there's this influx of volunteer regiments that need a seasoned, professionally trained guidance. And so that's really what opens the door for Grant. And because he's got that, he rises up from being a regimental colonel up to be brigadier general pretty quick because of all the regiments. Really not a lot of experience. That guy seems to know what he's doing. You know, Winfield Scott patted him on the back in Mexico. That's good enough for me, you know? So that's basically it.
Before Chris comes down to the table to pay for his son's birthday party with you all, let's give him another round of applause.
Thank you all. Thank you.